loud. Namaste. Yeah, yeah. And they'll come out of their graves just like when Jesus rose. March around. Sometimes, you choose a whole thing to talk about because of a cartoon. You got a great cartoon about Ascension deficit disorder. I guess you got to talk about Ascension. And my big temptation on Ascension Sunday is always to use Steppenwolf's Magic Carpet Ride as one of the songs. But so far I've avoided actually doing it. I think, like so much of ancient scripture, what's important here isn't what happened, but what the authors were trying to say about what happened by the way they described it. And what I mean is this. There's, of the 3 readings we have for today, they're all from the Bible, obviously, but that's because I couldn't really come up with an Ascension tradition in any other tradition to use something to compare and contrast it with. But the second 2 are from today's readings. The first one is not. The Moses reading is not. But what I wanted to do was illustrate these recurring themes in the Bible, because I think if you're aware that the themes are there, you have a much better idea of what they're trying to say. It's kind of like Alfred Hitchcock, right? Alfred Hitchcock, I think always, or pretty close to almost always, had a cameo in the films he directed. You knew it was an Alfred Hitchcock movie because he showed up in it somewhere for just a minute. Sylvester Stallone tried to do the same thing when he directed the sequel to Saturday Night Fever, an unfortunate debacle called Staying Alive, but Sylvester appeared in it wearing a big fur coat, and I remember thinking at the time, just because you do what a great master doesn't make you a great master. And I don't think Alfred Hitchcock would have been caught dead in that coat. But anyway, there's essentially one great event in the Old Testament. And there are a handful of really important, but not quite so great events. And that great event is the Exodus. Moses leading the people out of captivity. Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and the 10 Commandments. Who is the Edward G. Robinson going, "Where's your Messiah now?" See, there's horrible acting, right? Horrible casting. Great movie. But the whole thing about Moses, when Jewish people think of Moses, we might say, well, it's the 10 Commandments. And that's one of those, I would suggest, second-tier things. Yes, Moses gave the 10 Commandments. That thing that people who are obsessed with the rules love to bring out that verse. Grace and truth, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. But saying that the biggest thing Moses ever did was receive the 10 Commandments, which he really screwed up, right? Because he broke the first ones because he got angry. Moses needed anger management. But denying that he led the people through the desert, the wilderness of the desert, for 40 years, which really means as long as it took, but suggests that not only did Moses have an anger management problem, he was maybe the first man to refuse to stop and ask directions. But that's the bigger thing, because the people had been slaves. And he led them out. And of course, he famously led them out by parting the waters of the Red Sea. So then you get to this reading from 2 Kings, and what does Elijah do? He takes his cloak, he parts the waters. If you're a Jewish person of the time, it's like automatic. You think Moses. You think Exodus. You think this means something really great is going to happen. This means Elijah is somehow carrying on the work of Moses. Elijah, though, was a prophet. And then if you remember, when Jesus went up on the mountaintop and the apostles all ate some mushrooms, and then Moses and Elijah appeared all sparkly, and then Jesus got all sparkly and was transfigured. That picked up that theme, Moses, Exodus, the law, and also the lawgiver, Elijah, the great prophet, come together, they disappear, and Jesus is there, who's saying, and what they're trying to say is Jesus fulfills the whole thing. But if you don't know those connecting points, you completely miss that. And then it seems like Moses and Elijah were hanging around in heaven and had nothing to do that day. God said, Jesus looks a little lonely down there. Why don't you fellas run down and say hello? And you miss it. Elijah was also the first religious figure to have a groupie. It was Elisha, who wouldn't leave him alone. How irritating would it be to say to somebody 3 times, is it? You wait here. And they're like, no, I'm coming with you. It's like having a 3-year-old. But what happens to Elijah? He basically, although he apparently needs a chariot to do it, he has an ascension. Whoop, he goes carried up into heaven. And so when we get to Ascension Day, Jesus has his ascension. Did he really float off into the clouds? I don't know. I wasn't there. But to worry about that too much is to miss the point, which is just like Elijah. Jesus goes up into heaven, and people see it happen. Why do we care? Well, for me personally, the takeaway is this. What did Moses do? He led the people out of a lousy situation. What happens to Elijah? Well, before this, he gets into a whole bunch of trouble. When you call down fire on the prophets of Baal, or you raise a lot of, how would I say this delicately? Not like he wrote graffiti on somebody else's church, but pretty darn close. And yet, he did what God asked him to do, and he was able to largely avoid the consequences of that. And he too, through his faithfulness, gets lifted out of this horrible situation that he had been laboring in for a long time. Jesus, the same way. He did what he needed to do, but he got into trouble. Because society doesn't like somebody who tells society that you're not doing this right. And I think the dividing line or the discriminating point is this. Contemporary Christians have this belief that God is going to sort of spray them in Teflon, and they're never going to have struggles, they're never going to have hard times, they're never going to be caught in the muck, they're never going to have to go through things or work through things. And that's just not supported by any of the scriptural evidence. It's almost as if we want to be, to mention another horrible movie, the boy in the bubble. Like, we'll just have this bubble around us, and in this case, not so much because we don't have an immune system, but because God's going to keep all that away. And then when the bad stuff happens, this is a really damaging thing about this. Something bad then happens, because that's what life is, and then we start to say, okay, what did I do wrong that caused this bad stuff to happen? And the answer, honestly, is nothing. The answer is, to quote the bumper sticker, shit happens. And the way that I believe religion and spirituality ought to function is to say, yes, shit happens, but That's not the end of the story. But looking back on those moments, we can see we really grew and changed in them. We were challenged. They weren't always comfortable. But in the end, we learned something from them. Wanting sort of this existence where there's no challenges, no excitement, no disappointment. Wanting essentially a really boring life, while wanting it to be interesting and exciting, I think is asking for something that you just can't have. And so instead of seeing problems as punishment, I think it's much more accurate, although not very easy at times, to see them as opportunity. There's a story in Buddhism about a woman whose child died. And she went to the Buddha and said, "This is horrible, bring my child back to life." And the Buddha said, "Okay, just go and get me a mustard seed from a house that has never seen death." And she went all through the town and knocked on every door, and she couldn't find a house that had never seen death. And so she came back to him and buried her child and followed the Buddha. We can think we're the only one, but we're not. We're not nearly as alone as we imagine. And if we look closely enough, there may even be a mini Moses in our life to help lead us out of it. Or not.
I actually found myself drawn to a completely different theme related more to the passing on of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And if memory serves me right, even Moses, when he was forbidden to enter the Promised Land, sort of passed on some of his spirit
To Joshua.
So that tradition of handing on spirit, although it's really puzzling, I found myself thinking, well, how is it, let me have twice your spirit, you know? So I wish I, was able to go back to the Hebrew or whatever, but I'm guessing that it's not spirit as in soul or whatever, it's the breath of God, the power of God.
I think there was a different word used for in other translations or a different sense.
Oh, what's in, so I could be totally off based on the different translations, but the thing the parallel that I was seeing between the second two readings was ultimately Jesus' point was my incarnational presence is no longer needed. And if you cling to that, to grab from another gospel, there's a limit, but that the spirit that was handed on from Moses went to one. The spirit that was handed on from Elijah went to one. The spirit that was handed on from Jesus, the awareness of the divine presence in us was intended to be awakened in all.
I remember now, as you talk about that from my undergrad, that there's also something with that double portion. Was generally the firstborn son got a double share of the inheritance, and so Elisha was trying to tie himself to Elijah, and in that sort of a way, because it also then conveyed a certain authority to speak in the name of your father when you had this. So it wasn't just that he was greedy. It's that he wanted to pass along this tradition, but felt he needed some kind of seal of approval, or
the handing on the mantle,
yes,
so to speak.
yeah.
The
Well,
fact-
and literally with
literally, and then the fact that he could do with it what Elijah had done. But so again, just mainly what struck me is that when you see the common themes, then you don't have to worry quite so much about, could they tickle Jesus' toes until he got out of space,
yeah,
out of reach. But you know the cosmology, you know the understanding of how things work at the time. So Jesus actually didn't get into he didn't asphyxiate
right,
his risen body because he got up with the air where the air was too thin. But the point was they experienced his presence somehow after his death. They experienced in a powerful way the ongoing awareness of his love beyond, no longer restricted to one manifestation, but it spread and spread and spread. And how do we explain that?
right. You left the barn door open. In the Old Testament, one cow had left, and when it comes to Jesus, the whole herd sneaks out. And I think we've lost in the last 50 years or so a sense of what storytelling is, and some people are trying to bring it back, but they're so wrapped up in factual account. Give me the news story, and yet then we turn around and get lost in a novel, and there's some great things that can come out of novels, but we've just somehow disconnected that.
What's interesting, on the way here, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about a more common practice these days of prosecutors, if they introducing rap lyrics as evidence of criminal intent.
Wow.
And someone in the criminal justice research area took Johnny Cash songs and a Kingston Trio song, took those lyrics, and presented them in two different studies to people. And if they, and asked whether they thought they were rap lyrics or country western lyrics, and over all sorts of other measures. If the people thought they were country western, they had much less negative interpretations and all of the other parameters of assessments of, someone writing those were very different than if they thought they were rap. And so it's sort of, again, you need to understand, she said, most rural white Americans don't understand the aesthetic of what is and not necessarily that I appreciate rap music, but you have to at least
Right.
Know that why it is structured the way it is structured, as opposed to, why a country western song is structured the way it's structured, or why a rock song is structured the way it's structured, and recognize that they're different. That doesn't mean that the same lyrics in one show intent to commit murder, and in the other it's art.
Yeah. Well, why, when Johnny Cash shot a man just to watch him die?
Right.
Didn't everybody get upset and say, "Oh my God, he's going to lead our children to shoot people just to watch them die"?
Yeah. So it just struck me as similar to this. You need to understand what is the literary quality of
yeah.
biblical stories.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think, when you start to see these gross misinterpretations of things, you start to see people who aren't understanding, or even believing that there exists a literary tradition, which.
Yeah. No. Instead, you end up explaining how you can strike a river with a shawl and it doesn't get soaking wet.
Right. Or laying on snakes and wondering why you get bit. I mean, or there Yeah. That's why you should pay attention in English class, kids. Shall we pray about stuff?